Atlas of Joan E. Beaudoin.
Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming on this snowy day. It's kind of funny, but I'm going to present on something that I worked on during the summer, not this past summer, because I had to set this aside because I was working on 3 other projects. But this will take us back to a warmer period in time, in my life anyway. So this presentation looks at how object descriptions in libraries, archives, and museums, otherwise known as LAMs, which I'll use throughout the presentation, can be visualized in ways that offer unique views onto institutional collections. So in terms of what I'll cover, oh, wait a minute. Let's see if I can get the, there we go, that's a little better. So in terms of what I'll cover, I'll provide a bit of background information about the project. Then I'll give you a brief information, visualization, or introduction, because I'm not sure how many people in the room are familiar with those. Then I'll discuss the data that I analyzed, and I'll touch upon how that data was normalized and what that means in preparation to actually visualize that. Then we'll look at several visualizations that were created from the data and go over some of the implications of what they reveal. And then finally, I'll provide some concluding remarks concerning the so what factor of information visualization for LAM data. So since one's approach to a topic has implications, and most of you know that I teach metadata and cataloging, while I teach in that area, I don't really have a background in information visualization. I did take a course in data analytics while I was at Drexel, and I participated in a MOOC about information visualization. So I come at this from a very kind of low level. And I wanted to see, because I probably have a similar background to collection staff in libraries, archives, and museums, I wanted to see what I could do to create visualizations. So that's a bit about, kind of where I came from. But I actually stumbled upon how I could go about doing this through a blog post by Mia Ridge, who had gone to the Cooper Hewitt Museum for a week and looked at their collection data. I was looking for kind of good examples of description practices that I could share with my students, because they often make mistakes and don't really understand what the implication of those mistakes are. And her posting was all about how awful it was during that week to clean up the data that she wanted to visualize. And so that, it kind of met 2 of my interests. One, the metadata side, and the other side, the teaching, and how that could inform what I was presenting to students. But on a more theoretical level, it really has to be acknowledged that LAM data is wholly underutilized. Single records might be examined by staff and the general public and scholars, but there are many different ways that this data can be utilized. Because we spend a great deal of time, energy, and funds producing, manipulating, and/or purchasing that data, the expectation should be that we do a lot more with this data than just single record displays. Beyond this, my research interests fall within the visual realm and access, and also into the access and use of cultural heritage collections. So this was a really nice marriage of those interests. I'm particularly interested in visual information in all its forms, so I wanted to see how information visualizations kind of fit into what I know already about visual information. So, to sum, in this project, I wanted to find out what was involved in creating visualizations of cultural heritage data, what processes were involved, what visualization tools were out there with a low threshold for use. And of course, I was also interested in how the visualizations might actually be used. So the data set that I'll present on is from the Henry Ford. And so I thought it would be good to begin with a screenshot of the collections page. And this is a very typical example of what you find when a museum actually presents their collections online. It's, you know, a page of tiled thumbnails. In this case, actually, there is actually a little bit of a word cloud at the bottom that's created from the keywords, which is a very unusual offering. If you look at most museum collection presentation on their website, it's very much just a tiled list of thumbnails, sometimes with a few little captions. They, by and large, have limited or no organizational principles which would provide some contextual information for the objects that are displayed. In some cases, they're displayed just by a session number. Sometimes you can't tell how they're actually displayed. While that design works well enough for those folks who are looking for particular items or for items by a particular group or individual, it's not really so useful if you're trying to get a sense of what the institution is all about. This is where information visualization can be really helpful, since they provide a higher level view onto the collection, which we'll see in a few minutes. For this and the next few slides, I'm going to show you just some searches that I performed relating to Diego Rivera on several local collections to illustrate the typical tile display of retrieval items, and each one is followed by a single record that was just kind of chosen at random. So this is from the Henry Ford, this is the Detroit Institute of Art, and this is the Virtual Motor City from Wayne State. There's a record. So to give you just a kind of a gentle introduction to information visualization, I'll talk about what it is, why we should do it, and then I'll provide some frameworks that'll help you understand different kinds of information visualization. So in terms of what is information visualization, the whole point of creating and examining visualizations is to extract insight from complex data sets. So lots of data that you can't really make any sense of as the whole. One of the ways that information visualizations work is the fact that they focus our attention on a particular kind of information through the abstraction, and this one obviously is Google Maps on museums in this general vicinity. So through the abstraction, these help to reveal patterns in data, help us develop an understanding about and through the data, draw us in, inspire us to keep working and asking questions, and perhaps most importantly, for those of us who are responsible for record creation and management, they show that all the time and effort spent on describing collection items can serve additional useful functions. So there are various kinds of analysis that are commonly found using information visualization techniques. Here, this one is dealing with time. It's a temporal visualization. And I'm showing term frequencies, several term frequencies that are compared across time using the Google's book corpus. Then there are geospatial visualizations, and this one shows the percentage of change in population according to county here in Michigan, with the green being an increase and the red being a decrease. Then there are topical information visualizations, and this one uses citation analysis to develop a map of science, and you can see there's a little bit of humanities that some science is linking to at the very top left of the image. And then there are network analyses, and these types of visualization show relationships between individuals in this case, but you can also have networks of events and places and things also linked with people. Then you also need to think about, well, what is the level of analysis that's being undertaken? And there are, this is on a continuum, so you have micro level or an individual level of analysis, as this one is, which is the network that shows Pablo Picasso's documented connections to various individuals. Then there's kind of this middle or a local level of analysis, which is usually in the hundreds or thousands of different items that you're looking at. And in this one, they're using a database of Johann Winkelmann's 18th century antiquarians. And the blue is their birthplace, and the red is the death place. So you can see that lots of people went to Rome in the 18th century, and that's where they died, in Paris, London, and so forth. And then there's a macro level of analysis, which is more at a global level, and this looks at tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of different things. And in this case, this examined an art dealer in London for the year 1901, and it shows us where the places were that they were most active, who the artists were that they were selling. Those are some of the nodes, and other nodes were actually their clients. So you can see who, if you can actually zoom into this. This is kind of sorry, it's about all that I could get off the web. So you can zoom into this, and that's typical for most of these really high-level macro visualizations. So in terms of what is needed to create the visualizations, well, you need data, you need tools for normalization, otherwise known as data cleaning, and then a means to visualize the data. So in terms of the data that I used, I was sent 2 Excel files from the Henry Ford that they were so nicely allowed me to mess with. And there are 18 fields in the spreadsheet of data, and I'm showing those here. They remove some of the more, some of the items that perhaps they didn't want people to see in terms of like valuation and insurance and so on and so forth. So those were all the fields that I received. So analyzing the data really began with examining the spreadsheets to understand what each of the elements, which are the columns in the spreadsheet, meant and how it was structured and any of the standards that existed behind them. So for example, the geographic names in the data set use the headings from the Thesaurus of Geographic Names from the Getty, and subject terms came from the Library of Congress's subject headings, the Library of Congress's Thesaurus of Graphic Materials, and the Getty's Art and Architecture Thesaurus, and they also use an in-house subject list. So in terms of data normalization, data is always dirty. That's something everybody complains about when they visualize data. And that was the case even with this data set. That was, by all accounts, probably the cleanest data that I ever have examined. Like I said, there are always problems. And some of the common ones are, is it a singular or plural? So is it gelatin silver print or gelatin silver prints? There are qualifiers to some entries, so is it buttons, information artifacts, buttons, fasteners, or just plain buttons? And what do you do with the just plain buttons? In terms of the granularity, there's different levels of that. So for example, the object type field contained the broad term photography, but it also contained the narrower terms tintype, cyanotype, daguerreotype, and so forth. Order was also an issue, as I found, especially in the geographic data, because it could be entered as country, state, city, or it could be city, state, country, or just the city, or just the state, and so on and so forth. So all of these variations really need to be normalized so that you can get the correct numbers to then create your visualizations. And you'll see what I mean by that in a minute, because everything is based on frequencies of occurrence, at least in the data that I visualize. So now I'll walk you through a few of the processes that I use to clean up the data. Beyond the variations that I just discussed in the terms that are used in the spreadsheets, there are also issues concerning formatting. So here we see that multiple entries were given in each cell, so we need a single entry per cell to actually be able to analyze it correctly, so it means a bit of manipulation. So you copy the column, you paste it into Word, you remove the space formatting, you paste it back into Excel, then you use a formula in column B, which I'm showing on the left, to indicate how many times that actually occurs in the spreadsheet, and then the one on the right you dedupe and you see the number of occurrences. So that's the basic data normalization technique that I use for the spreadsheet data. However, how do you deal with all those variations in terminology? Well, one of the best tools that you can use currently is OpenRefine, which is a software. It used to be known as Google Refine. You download it onto your machine. This is what it looks like when it opens. You locate your file. You open the file and you see it pretty much replicates kind of a spreadsheet look and feel. But it has this really nifty feature where you can facet things. So in this case, I'm faceting the subject column, and it's a text-based field, so that's what I did. And then you'll see on the left that blue box that says subject, and then you cluster those, and it provides you clusters of entries that are similar to one another and the number of times they occur, and then you can go in and actually provide a new cell value that will take into account all of those different entries and then normalize them in that way. So once you do that, and you have, again, a spreadsheet of your entries and the occurrences, you now can visualize the data. And one of the tools that I use that was pretty easy to use is IBM's Many Eyes. So you upload your data set. So I just copied the entries and the occurrences. You paste it into that empty box at the top. It shows you what it's supposed to look like, or what it is looking like at the bottom there. You have to make sure things are working the way they should. Then you tell them a bit about the data, you upload the data, and then you visualize it. And then they give you a bunch of different types of visualizations that you can choose from. And so here's one that's an interactive tree map for applied subjects. And in case you don't know how to read these, they use color and size to tell you which items occur the most. So the ones that are the largest and darkest in color are the things that occurred most often. And I will tell you that there were 63,295 entries for subject in the data set that I worked with. When I cleaned up the data, there were 23,265 unique subjects in the data set. And then I'm only presenting here, I only use the data for all subjects that occurred 10 times or more in the data set, because there were just so many items. And it really wouldn't have made any sense in the visualization. So to give you a sense of the subjects that are represented in the Henry Ford collection, these are the 20 most frequently encountered subject occurrences. And if you were actually able to interact with this, as I have shown you here, there's one little tile that I've highlighted. It's Grand Prix racing, and there are 51 instances within the data that I examined. So some of these will seem, really make sense for the Henry Ford collection, if you know the Henry Ford collection, and others you'll think, really? Okay. So automobiles, 5,009. Exhibitions, 2,200. Automobile racing, just over 1,000. Advertising, just over 1,000. United States presidents, okay. That was a little under 1,000. Exhibition buildings, 800. Racing cars, 776. Play, recreation, really? 728. Ford automobiles, 695. Children, really? 575. Commemorations, 565. Industrial design, 551. Automobile industry, 475. Interior decorations, 473. Automobile racing drivers, political campaigns, African Americans, 420. Civil wars, 409. Presidential candidates, 379. Obviously, this kind of analysis is broadly useful to the general public who will see it as, glance at this and see what kind of topics are represented by the collection, to scholars who would like to be able to determine which collections are strongest in their area of research, and also it's useful to collection staff who might want to adjust their collection development practices to better meet their institutional mission if they see subject headings that seem to be either not developed enough or not enough, or too well developed for the mission of their institution. So this is just another visualization. This is a histogram, which is a graphical representation of a distribution of data. And this shows a typical power law distribution of subject occurrences that are occurring in this collection. So you have a few subjects that are found a great many times, and then many subjects that are found only a few times. And just so that you know, there were 1,710 subjects in that data set. They were only applied once, so they were unique in the data set. And again, for this one, I just visualized those occurrences that were 10 times or over. So another visualization that I looked at was the creation date for the objects. And I grouped everything by periods of 50 years. And this one shows that the predominant dates represented in the Henry Ford are those items that were created between 1900 and 1945, which it's a really interesting finding. Why is it that there's almost twice as many objects for that period in time than any other period in time? You could understand that maybe earlier items are rarer and we weren't here in the United States at that point in time, so they would be harder to collect. But it is a kind of interesting finding about the collection that perhaps no one really had thought to look at before. Another way is to look at the geographic distribution of the country of creation for the items held in the Henry Ford. And obviously, you can see that the US predominates, which you would imagine would be the case. But there are things from Australia and China and India, Europe, obviously, Southern Africa, South America, Canada. And then I looked at the state where items were created, and as we would understand, Michigan predominates, but then you can see New York also has a pretty high number, and states surrounding Michigan also pretty high, but also California. And then there are states that don't have any representation. So if you're a collection manager or somebody who's interested in history in, say, Idaho, you wouldn't be going to the Henry Ford to find your materials, likely. At least if you were interested in objects that were created in that state. So then I also, this is a bubble map, and this one visualizes what kind of object is within, or the kinds of objects that were within this data set that I examined. And here you see that photographic prints were the predominant item, and that really shocked me when I saw this. I thought something to do with cars, but it's photographic materials, which is kind of a shocker. And So this also is interactive. If you go to IBM Many Eyes, their site, you can actually search using the box on the lower left-hand side for a particular item, and it will automatically go to that item and highlight it and then give you a little box that tells you how many. And this one is actually typewriters. Who knew the Henry Ford had 92 typewriters? At least in this data set. They probably actually have many more. So on the left you see, in ranking from most to least often occurring items, all of the different types of things that are held. So to see if in fact these visualizations, kind of a double check, to see if the visualizations were actually reflecting what I found, I did a Wordle where I just copied and pasted all the text from all the descriptive entries in the description field into Wordle. And lo and behold, what do we see? We see all those photographic processes are kind of bubbling to the top, so it really is clear that that is something that predominates in that collection. So in terms of, kind of what I learned from this, I think the information visualization technique really has some place in what we do in libraries, archives, and museums. It helps us furnish, it really provides us with a broad overview of the collection, and it allows us to assess the collection as a whole, which we typically do not do. It's just not something we've done in the past. Beyond that, it really invites questions about the collection and about the items in the collection, about the collection history. Why is what you're seeing so? What is happening that's creating that situation? Beyond that, information visualizations are really engaging. They are interactive. Many of them zoom, like those network analyses. If you click on one node, then a new node opens up. That was the Pablo Picasso, actually was part of that whole network that I showed you. So then you can explore in more detail the relationship between things or particular areas within the collection. It really is very engaging, and at a time when libraries, archives, and museums are struggling to get people to pay attention to their resources, this is one way that we could do that. It also provides a means of access into your collection, which is important for us. It's another means of exploration beyond that tiled display or beyond just the single record catalog entry. Other things that are probably most important for libraries, archive, and museum staff is that the processes really help identify data issues. It facilitates cleanup of the data. It's a very lengthy process. It took me 3 months basically to clean those 25,000 records. I didn't do it, 9 to 5, but it was a very long and arduous process, which when you have to do that, you're very careful about making sure what kind of data is being entered in what particular fields. It really streamlines your data entry process. It really forces you to think about documenting what you're doing and how you're doing it and controlling all of that. There really is need for additional research. We need improved tools. None of these were without their problems, and they were all kind of clunky to work with, even though they do what needs to get done. We need how-to manuals for library, archive, and museum staff. I don't know if any of you participated in the webcast yesterday that was put on by OCLC in the San Francisco Public Library. It was on linked data, and that was one issue that people asked about time and time again. This is fabulous, we can see the need for it, but we don't have the skills and the understanding to actually do this. How do we do it? So there really is this need for more support of library, archives, and museum staff. And we also need studies of the different user communities that actually use those visualizations so that we can develop increased tools for people to be able to use those in useful ways. And here are some resources. The first one is a really nice presentation that basically talks about some other visualization techniques that were done by somebody who worked previously at the Met and now works for Google. And so thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them if I can.
Do you provide anything back to the Henry Ford? Was that
I
part of
gave-
the deal? Like,
You know, they were very, there was a student that had taken several courses with me, and she worked there, and so that's how I kind of got the entree to the data, and they were very happy to provide me with the data. You know, I told them I'm not going to go, you know, putting it out on the web for everybody to interact with. Oh, thank you. So I did clean the data and then sent it back to them, and they were very thankful to have that clean data because then they could go back and update their records. And as I found out later on, these were actually records that they had already cleaned. So you can imagine, you know, they were very concerned that they didn't want to give me data that would make them look bad. So they gave me only records that they themselves had okayed and cleaned previously. So if I still spent 3 months cleaning that data, you can see how much of an issue that is for legacy data that we've all been collecting now for decades and decades and decades. So yes, I did.
But do you have any sense of how trusting they were of the work that you did? And you know, that here you're giving them this data set back, but you say, yeah, I spent, you know, all these hours on this stuff, and
Well, there
you know,
were actually people that from the Henry Ford, when I first gave a variation of this presentation, the gal that I actually had emailed directly and gotten the data from was in the audience, and I didn't realize it until afterwards because I had never met her. But she was very thankful, and actually she was the one who had me come, and then I gave a talk to the Henry Ford for their all-staff meeting last year about this time, and they were really interested in what I was doing, but they felt that they didn't, from my conversations, at least with her, she felt they didn't really have, again, they didn't have the expertise that they felt that they needed to support an effort like this. Which is very sad to me because I think this shows some really some promise for their collection. And if I take this a bit further, what if we could do this for all collections in the Detroit area? What if we could say, show me everything that pertains to Detroit? All subjects, all object types in all of the institutions. Then if you visited a particular place, you would know. I always visit museums when I go to a different state or a city, or when I travel, I always go to a different museum. That would tell me what museum I would find most interesting. Think about scholarship associated with that.
I'm thinking along those lines about professionalism versus democratization of the sources. So when you talk about like folksonomies and social tagging, like it seems to me that maybe a bridge in between them taking your data and officially making it part of their MARC records or however that works would be somehow folding in a process where it could be more open for other people to assign tags, to link it to Facebook and social media so that it's more of a democratic process. Is there, I know there's work on folksonomies and all that, but is that related to your work at all?
This, I could see how you could use that. Again, that would be even more data that you would then have to analyze, which tends to be even messier. Like, folksonomies can be a double-edged sword because a lot of people will provide you entries, but then they're not controlled entries. So then all the synonym controls, and so it's completely gone, which has its own, wonders and issues associated with it. But there has been work in the museum realm, like I think it's museum, MU.SEU.M. It was a MET initiative, a Metropolitan Museum of Art initiative, where you could go and tag items in their collection, and they found there was a discrepancy between what collection staff were describing their objects as and what the general public would identify the things as. So yes, there is definitely a need for, to make that bridge there. But in terms of visualizing them, visualization is at such a high level, you wonder, you want to make sure that what you're saying, you do have all of these photographs, is in fact, that's a photograph and not a, aquatint or a lithograph or something, which maybe the general public wouldn't understand. It would, in some ways, I think it would water down the scholarly interest in the visualization, even though I think it might still help people become more interested and so forth.
Did you have a sense when you presented to the people at Henry Ford what those 25,000 objects represented from the total of their collections? You referred to the typewriters. There were only 12 records, but you were sure they had more. I mean, ultimately, the study looks at the things that there's description for.
Right.
How much else is there that's not yet described?
They didn't really go into detail, but I knew that it was a subset of the number of items held.
But the reason I ask that question is that it could actually be equally important to them, because if description and metadata occurs, for instance, with a photograph that is getting reproduced by the request of a researcher, the data that you've been given can also be a reflection of what is it that researchers are asking to have duplicated, or what is it that the institution gives priority to creating metadata for, and equally valid, what is it not investing time describing or cataloging, and may want to be prioritized, or maybe that also leads in the opposite direction towards the accessioning decisions. I don't know.
Yeah,
25,000 is not a lot of items
No,
for an enterprise of their size. I would have expected that they've got to have hundreds of thousands of objects, and particularly if you see representation of photographs. Did you see any representation of manuscript items?
I didn't, but I did. I wasn't looking. I didn't go and then look at the data. Yeah, I will say that the 23,000 odd records were actually the ones that are presented online, or were presented online at the time when they gave me
So again,
the data.
it might be what they've chosen to put in their online system. Okay.
Yes. Now, in
Not that
terms
that's
of
a
how
fault,
they
but just
chose,
understanding the parameters there.
I don't know. I think it was probably partially by request what they thought was most popular, things that people would identify with the Henry Ford. I think all of that kind of went into it, but I think there's also, what did they have time to actually examine?
And that may also then play into your surprise at the top of pieces that came out.
Yeah, the presidential,
These are
the
the
children.
things that they may be putting into exhibit or online exhibit.
Right.
Because those are the stories that they're choosing to tell.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you do need somebody who has a expert knowledge of the collection to kind of help you, unless you have the whole collection. If I had the whole collection and visualized the whole collection, well then you would basically kind of have an understanding of the collection, but since I only was processing a small segment, again, I can't make any generalizations about everything that the Henry Ford.
I was surprised to see how many were not dated.
Oh, I know.
Yes,
I
a
know.
significant amount were,
I know.
With
I
no-
think that
no
would be
date.
pretty
Without-
basic.
Yes.
yeah.
That's
there's
also a great
big-
unknown though, with accepting a gift. You have no idea what it is.
Mhm.
Well, sometimes, you would think that, and they did in many cases, it might have just been the way that the data was sorted. In some cases, they also provided just the century, or it could even be a century approximation.
Mhm.
So, they did, in most cases, there was a date, and I would have to say that that was probably only a small percentage of items didn't have any entry there. I was surprised that the date was pretty rich. Yeah.
Question. How small a data set could institutions work with that would be something they might be able to do with a very small staff and not spending so much time? I'm just trying to get it just seemed, you spent the entire summer on 25,000, and I'm thinking,
A couple hours a day, because that's about all your mind can take.
Yeah.
Because after,
Yeah.
cluster and looking at all those little
Look,
entries in
if
the
you look at,
spreadsheet.
like our collection, our special collections, or rare books, or something like that, that's a much smaller subset of our larger collection, how could you go into something in sort of more of a discrete area and analyze that area within itself, and that would be doable?
Mhm.
Maybe it's just the books that we have before, 2000 or 1900 or something like
Right.
that. What country of origin, what language, what subject, or what, something like that, where you've got dates and things that are more manageable in a very much smaller subset. And once you clean that up, then go to the next one.
Yeah, I mean,
'Cause
that's
I'm just trying to
certainly
figure
a
out
way,
how
how
could
to
work,
actually
how
divide
the
and
library,
conquer.
might be able to
Mhm.
work with that, because it just seems kind of mind-boggling.
But don't forget that you need a specific number to be able to get the occurrences that then create the visualization that actually means something. Because if you're only if there's only 100 things there, then you could process in your own brain.
Yeah,
You don't
so you need how, like,
1,000.
at least 1,000, or you need
I would
10,000?
say I would start at maybe 5,000.
And that's individual objects?
Yes,
Or
individual
objects that they're-
discrete records.
It also depends on how detailed you want to describe
Yeah.
some subjects.
Well, I was just my mind was just thinking it would be so great. I don't know if we can do this, if we can already do this through Millennium in some way. But just, the idea was our special collections, because we're still discovering things. But what are the concentrated areas, or just language and date ranges and things like that, and how much of it is, I don't know, just by subject. I know we've got a lot of literature, you can just see that by walking in, especially, but.
I know that was something that came up yesterday in the linked data conversation, because once you link all of this data, then you can basically add like little applications on, which then call upon that data to create visualizations or to create graphics that show, yesterday we circulated, 52,000 items in whatever, in book
Subject
form,
area.
and 3,432 items from journals, and so on and so forth. That are graphics that can go on the library's website. So it's out there already, it's just a matter of having the staff expertise to be able to navigate those technologies to put that out there.
And some data are easier, like this day, some are messier, like the subjects, and
Right.
particularly the granularity, whether there's hierarchy
Right.
among them. So like the subjects, they're all treated the same, like automobile, cars, automobile
Yes.
industry, racing,
Yes.
they all treated the same.
There were no hierarchies in the way that they entered subjects.
Is there any tools out there that can deal with that complexity, that kind of?
I believe there are ontological tools that you can use to create structure out of unstructured data. I personally don't know of them, but I believe there are tools out there that can create structure based on other ontologies. And especially since in libraries, we have
Yeah.
kind of standardized vocabularies that we've used for a long time. So that is really an advantage in the library world. Museums don't have that by and large. The Henry Ford, I was pretty surprised that they were using Library of Congress subject headings, the Getty's Art and Architecture Thesaurus, some of those tools that are out there. I was really very impressed that they actually were using them. Now, if that was only those 23,000 records, maybe, I don't know.
So how does Getty interact with some of the other hierarchies? I mean,
Getty actually, they published a few months ago all of their reference standardized vocabularies, so the ULON, the Union List of Artist Names, the Thesaurus of Geographic Names, and the Art and Architecture Thesaurus are all out there as linked data right now. So you could tie into that and do some really incredible stuff.
but shouldn't that be the LC of imagery?
It is.
But that's what I'm trying to figure, okay, so then that is really the one that they're using, but then they're using other ones which are that relate to imagery.
Library of Congress subject headings, they're
Right,
still,
but that's
they're
more
still
text.
applicable. Automobiles is a Library of Congress subject heading. There's the Thesaurus of graphic materials, but that has a very historical focus and also kind of advertising print media focus, visual broadsides and things of that nature that you would find. That's what that vocabulary really is richest in. So there are things out there. Yeah. So I hope I've, gotten you
Interesting, thank you.
interested in this area. Thanks very much.
Thank you.